Can you feel it in the air, folks? The flowers are chirping, the birds are blooming, and E3 is back, y'all! That's right, after skipping out last year due to the Corona mountain virus, the Gamers Super Bowl returns once more in an online format. The biggest thing that most people look forward to during E3 week are the press conferences and other similar associated events, particularly from the big three console manufacturers, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. These presentations are where most of the major reveals during the year happen, so naturally there's quite a bit of speculation throughout the months and weeks leading to the main event. This year has certainly been no different, with rumors, discussions, and supposed leaks around every corner of the internet. One of these rumors that's been gaining traction recently is the possibility of a 2D Metroid getting announced during Nintendo's E3 showing. This isn't the first time this alleged title has been suggested, however this year it's a bigger part of the general conversation going into the show. While we won't truly know the validity of these rumors until afterwards, being the Metroid fan I am, I want an excuse to talk about it. More specifically, I want to talk about it in the context that this is a real project in development right now. While as of this recording we don't know officially whether or not a new 2D Metroid is going to arrive on the Switch, there's some strong indicators to suggest such a thing isn't too far-fetched, even putting the rumors aside. Back in 2017, Nintendo collaborated with Mercury Steam to bring Metroid Samus Returns to the 3DS, a remake of Metroid 2 Return of Samus for the Game Boy in 1991. This studio, along with series co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto, had reportedly developed a positive working relationship during their time together, and the game has a hidden 100% ending that hints at a possible plotline for a future entry. Mercury Steam has yet to release another game since Samus Returns, meaning they've been working on something for nearly 4 years now. It's very possible that this could be the 2D Metroid on Switch that I and plenty of other fans have been waiting for. But this isn't about them, it's about me! Here is what I want to see from the next 2D Metroid. Since I'm going with the assumption that Mercury Steam is once again going to be developing this title, I think I should start with things I enjoyed from Samus Returns that I want to see, well, return. As well as things from that game that I think could either be improved upon or removed entirely. Overall, I think Samus Returns is a very solid entry in a bubble, despite some issues I have with its interpretation of Metroid 2. Those criticisms aren't very relevant here though, unless they're making another Metroid 2 remake. No, not that one. So let's start off with something that I really enjoyed from Samus Returns, and that's the Grapple Beam. The Grapple Beam was introduced in Super Metroid as a way for Samus to swing from one platform to another. It also becomes completely useless once the space jump is acquired, so it's probably not a shock that it didn't return for a future 2D entry until Samus Returns. While the Grapple Beam's swinging function is still made obsolete after acquiring the space jump, Samus Returns incorporates some new features into the Grapple Beam that still makes it useful despite this. This includes Samus being able to pull herself towards the grapple point in spaces that could not be accessed otherwise, debris that can only be cleared by using the Grapple Beam, and specific enemy weaknesses that can be exploited very similarly to Metroid Prime 3 Corruption's Grapple Lasso. The Grapple Beam became heavily utilized in the Prime trilogy, and it was really nice to see Mercury Steam implement that same level of practicality in a 2D game. I hope this is brought back in their next title and perhaps expanded even further with more functionality. I think the Scan Pulse is a fantastic addition for new Metroid players who might feel intimidated by the progression system at first glance. However, I also do have to admit that it is a little overpowered for series veterans like myself to utilize it. While on one hand it could be left the same since it is an optional ability, I think there's a couple of small tweaks that can be made to make it better suited for players of all skill levels, and just improve the formula overall. Remove the ability to reveal parts of the map, but have the breakable blocks revealed for longer. This would allow it to be used similarly to power bombs or the X-ray visor in Super Metroid, with the sole difference being it would only reveal what blocks are breakable, not what item is needed to actually break them. It still makes exploration feel less intimidating for newcomers, but now veterans have an easier option than just bombing every corner of the map on their first playthrough without accidentally revealing the path forward. One of the biggest additions to Samus Returns that fundamentally changed the gameplay was the new melee counter. In Samus Returns, enemies are far more aggressive than usual, consistently deviating from their general attack patterns to do a charging attack that dishes out more damage. Parrying this at the right time, Samus will block the move with her arm cannon and can be followed up with a powerful blast. This addition is really cool on paper, as melee combat isn't something the Metroid series has explored outside of Metroid Other M, and it allows Samus to show off her combat prowess in new and unique ways. In practice, the counter falls a bit short though, as it completely kills the player's momentum, which is understandable. There needs to be some balance at play. But the problem is that one, nearly every enemy in the game has an aggressive charge move. Sometimes these can be ignored, but a lot of the times they are intentionally placed to force you to engage with them. And two, the enemies are bullet sponges unless you fire the powered up shot that's followed up after the counter. This causes the game to slow down and become quite repetitive, as the player is either deliberately avoiding enemy encounters or having their momentum halted every few seconds so that they can counter another enemy. It's nowhere near farming health in NES Metroid bad, but it's probably the closest the series has come to that sense. This contributes to a larger issue which I'll address in a different bullet point, but basically despite gaining a brand new ability, your options in Samus Returns are more limited than in previous titles. Now I just spent a good bit there ragging on this mechanic, so you'll probably be surprised to hear that I actually kinda want this to return in the next game? Really? Yeah, albeit a bit more refined. While I don't think the counter is utilized properly in general gameplay, where I do think it shines is in boss fights. The boss fights are more spread out, so when they do an attack which you can counter, it feels fresh rather than something you're doing every few seconds. It also alleviates the momentum issue, as boss fights take place in enclosed spaces. I think this is the approach Mercury Steam should take if they are to bring the counter back in the next game. Give the enemies traditional 2D behaviors, or at least most of them, and make the counter a situational tool as opposed to a mandatory one. Then, utilize the counter in boss fights to test players on their reaction time. General area traversal should primarily challenge the player's puzzle solving and mapping abilities, whereas boss fights are there to challenge their combat prowess. This is how Metroid offers the best of both worlds, and adapting the counter to this philosophy, I think, is the way to truly make it shine. Next, let's talk about the other major gameplay addition to Samus Returns, that being the 360-degree directional aim. This is probably an unpopular opinion, but I'm really not a fan of the style, and I much prefer the traditional diagonal aiming in the past entries. There's two things about the directional aiming that turns me off. One, it takes away your movement abilities, meaning you are firmly planted on the ground while aiming, and two, the aiming isn't locked on your last position, which makes it a bit wobbly, as opposed to diagonal aiming, which is fixed. That being said, I know a lot of others who really enjoy it, and I don't want to take away this feature from folks who prefer this aiming style. I also think having this is a good accessibility feature for people who are just trying out the series. While diagonal aiming gives the player more control, it's also harder to master than the directional aiming, which is easier to grasp at a glance. I think a good compromise would be an option to choose a preferred aiming method and a toggle menu, but I also think it's possible to simply incorporate both into the default control scheme, since the Switch has a few more buttons than the 3DS. Left bumper could activate the diagonal aim, while the ZL trigger could activate the 360 directional aiming. Everyone wins! Another thing I want to cover is the role of the screw attack. While there are certain aesthetic preferences I prefer in the older titles, I don't think that's the focal point of the issues with it, and I would rather focus on more important aspects of its implementation in Samus Returns. It might seem like a small nitpick at first, focusing so heavily on a single item which largely functions similarly to previous entries. However, I think it contributes to a larger issue in Samus Returns that I talked about when discussing the counter mechanic. This contributes to a larger issue which I'll address in a different bullet point. The Metroid series has a unique take on fulfillment of the power fantasy, which also doubles back as feedback into the primary gameplay loop of exploration. You start the game off with little health, ammo, and abilities, then throughout the course of the game slowly power yourself up until you become an overpowered force of destruction. If you've played any Metroid game, you're well familiar with this sensation. Not only does this make the player feel empowered, but it also eases the backtracking which is necessary to progress through the game. Going through previous areas becomes easier, and more importantly cuts time when you have a cool new ability that quickly takes care of a group of enemies that previously took a bit more time to deal with. The apex of this design philosophy is when the player finally collects the screw attack, which is always one of the last upgrades to be obtained in the 2D entries. Almost every enemy, including bullet sponges and even a few invulnerable enemies, can now be instantly killed with a deadly somersault. This ingenious move not only instantly plows through everything that dares stand in your way, but because it's a natural part of your movement, you don't have to pause and kill your momentum. Because this takes place near the end of the game, it makes the final item cleanup significantly more manageable and the backtracking far less daunting. It might seem counterintuitive to give this much power to the player near the end of the game, as this should theoretically be where the game is at its most challenging, but that's where the boss fights come in. The bosses, and specifically the final boss in this case, is specifically balanced to test the player at their most powerful. Samus Returns deviates a bit from this by nerfing the screw attack pretty significantly. Most of the buffed enemies you encounter will take around 2 to 3 hits from the screw attack to take down, as opposed to a single somersault. This might not seem like much at first, but it adds up quickly when backtracking through multiple areas filled to the brim with enemies which are all now more aggressive than usual, as mentioned previously. It seems as if Mercury Steam wanted to add more challenge to the general explorative gameplay, but rather than further testing and developing the player's skills, it just makes the backtracking more tedious as they have to constantly stop to take care of enemies. It's literally the exact same problem as how the counter is implemented. There's no added challenge, it's just padding. Not even fun padding at that, since it also takes away a bit from that power fantasy trip. This might seem like an overly long explanation for bring back the old screw attack, but I really wanted to show why its implementation in Samus Returns ultimately hurts that game. Okay, fine, I'll mention the aesthetics too. Jeez, just look at this and tell me it sounds more badass and dangerous than the previous screw attacks while keeping a straight face. Yeah, I rest my case. There's 2 final notes I want to cover regarding Samus Returns, but I'm not going to talk about it for too long because I have a hypothesis that these changes were made due to the 3DS's hardware limitations, which obviously won't be an issue on the Switch. This is regarding the overall movement and speed of the game, as well as the removal of the speed booster, which is personally my favorite item in the 2D Metroid games, by the way. Samus Returns is slower than any 2D Metroid since, well, Metroid 2 Return to Samus. Samus's running and falling speed are already inherently slower, and this feeling is further exacerbated by a locked frame rate of 30 frames per second. It was probably necessary to make these changes so that each room could fully load in time without causing the game to stall or even crash. I have a feeling this next Metroid game will be significantly faster in line with Zero Mission, and at the very least I fully expect it to run at 60 frames per second. Well, those are all my notes relating to Samus Returns, but this theoretical entry we're talking about isn't another remake. It's a brand new game, meaning it should have its own identity and quirks to set it apart from other games in the Metroid series. Let's talk about some new features as well as some updated takes on old philosophies that I would be interested in seeing become a reality. I played through Bloodstained Ritual of the Night again recently, and it got me thinking about ways for Mercury Steam to innovate their rumored 2D Metroid game. One thing that stood out to me during my most recent playthrough was how the camera is used to change perspective at various points depending on how the room is shaped. It allows these locations to warp and wrap around as if they were in a 3D gameplay environment while still playing like a 2D side-scroller. Another game that does this really well actually is Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Hey, another game from a developer with a history in Metroid. It got me thinking back to Samus Returns and how the camera is mostly static throughout that adventure with the exception of cutscenes and successful counters. It adds more cinematic flair, sure, but it doesn't change the actual gameplay, whereas in Bloodstained and Tropical Freeze, those cameras change during normal gameplay to accommodate for environments that break the traditional 2D plane, such as a spiraling staircase or a hallway that occupies the X or Z axis as opposed to the Y axis. Metroid Other M even does some similar things despite being a game with 3D movement, where you can run in the direction of a hallway or structure with a consistent curvature and Samus will smoothly follow along without the need to utilize the directional buttons controlling the opposing axis. With a series like Metroid that emphasizes the fun of precision movement, especially in the 2D entries, Having similar sections of environments that are this dynamic could lead to some truly spectacular gameplay hooks and map design never before explored. Imagine a speed booster puzzle where you navigate through some traditional 2D room, but wind up in a room where the camera changes perspective, revealing a damaged wall at the X-axis that you can now boost through solely because of that camera change. I don't know, sounds cool in my head at least. Metroid Fusion is among one of my favorite Metroid games, which might be a shock to some of you watching this. It's not a perfect game, but there's something unique about it that elevates the experience so high for me, and that is the use of dynamic areas that change as the game progresses. It's not uncommon in a Metroid game for an enemy to be swapped out with something tougher after you reach a certain point. Metroid Fusion takes this philosophy a step further and changes the areas you visit altogether. One moment a room can be completely normal, but can also be destroyed once you return to it much later, creating new platforms and opening up alternate passages for you to explore. One of my favorite examples of this is about halfway through the game when the power is cut, leaving you seemingly stuck on the main elevator. Rather than taking the same normal route back to your ship, you have to carve a new route using your arsenal to access the maintenance tunnels and get back onto the main deck. It's a really suspenseful moment the first time you play this section. Future Metroid games never really capitalized on these moments, which I always thought was a shame. On the plus side, it's a unique feature about Metroid Fusion that makes it stand out, but on the other hand, I simply can't let go of the possibility of expanding these moments further with the power of current technology. But as I mentioned before, Fusion isn't perfect. Not every philosophy it introduced should carry over into future entries. So let's talk about something a bit more old school, shall we say. Going in the opposite direction of Metroid Fusion this time, I would like this next 2D entry to return to level progression guided by smart level design and subtle cues, as opposed to being guided by a marker or being limited to a linear sequential area progression. What exactly do I mean by this? Well, in Metroid Fusion, you're still largely doing the same tasks to make your way through the environment, except there's a marker on the map to point you in the right direction. The game tells you where to go, but not how to get there. In Samus Returns, there's no marker, however the level design is oddly sequential, even for a Metroid game. It is possible to beat Samus Returns without backtracking to a single area. It's only required for getting 100%. Even the original Metroid 2 had a hub area to backtrack to. For me, the exploration in Metroid is at its absolute best when it's designed around backtracking through multiple areas, not in a linear Zelda dungeon style like several recent titles, or the sequential order of Samus Returns. There's something so satisfying about getting lost, only to remember that one bomb block from the starting area you couldn't access before and finding the way forward through that discovery. Metroid Prime, in my opinion, does exploration the absolute best. Its progression involves consistently returning to previous areas, and its hit system, which can point you in the right direction, is completely optional. This is the philosophy I want to see utilized moving forward. Now this might seem like a weird bullet point to mention at first glance. Hasn't Metroid always embraced speedrunning? Yes, 2D Metroid games in particular have always included different ending screens based on completion time, encouraging you to play the game and practice your run to get that best ending. This is pretty standard. However, in professional speedrunning settings, you'll always see players sequence breaking as a means to get the fastest time possible, not as a means to get the best ending necessarily, but to get a world record time. Or, just for fun. Some people are into that. This is something that very few Metroid games have embraced, and I think this would be a perfect time to implement it once more. The big game that is known for its numerous sequence breaks is of course Super Metroid. While it's not my personal favorite entry, many fans still consider this the peak of the series, with some who even go as far as to call it the greatest game of all time. A huge part of that is because of the freedom the game gives the player through its sequence breaking opportunities and exploits. Even if you're playing the game casually, sequence breaking can be a lot of fun. My first ever playthrough of Super Metroid, I figured out how to get the wave beam early without looking up anything online. It felt fantastic using the tools the game gave me to go off of the intended path for a powerful weapon early on. And I'm sure several other Super Metroid players can relate to that story. The best part of all is that these sequence breaks don't ruin the game. The playthrough will still be quite challenging for a first-time player, regardless how many early abilities they gather. Now you might be thinking, Well, sure, that's fine and all, but Super Metroid is an old game. That's a design quirk of the retro era, since a lot of these games were rushed in at the last second, and thus many of these sequence breaks and exploits simply weren't detected during QA testing. And while sure, that might be true to an extent for Super Metroid, it doesn't make it any less fun, accident or not. But going beyond Super Metroid for a moment, there's a more recent game that employs this exact same philosophy towards sequence breaking, only it's completely intentional and a core part of the game design. It's a small indie title released in early 2017 you might have heard of called The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, Breath of the Wild is not a Metroidvania, and its progression is a bit different in that the game is pretty open-ended in which order you accomplish your objectives, and even if you choose to accomplish them at all. The similarities to Super Metroid come in the form of Link's abilities, especially his Sheikah Slate runes. While these powers have very specific uses in most situations, they also obey a consistent set of rules that when combined with the game's mechanics and physics can lead to all sorts of creative opportunities. The only limitation is your imagination. Take this example from my first playthrough. Here I am in a shrine and I can't figure out how to solve the puzzle the way the game wants me to. I need to get this electrical current to the other side so that it can power up the wall that's blocking the cog I need to reach the end. Then I remember that all metallic objects conduct electricity, so I make my way back through the shrine and bring back any sword, block, etc. I can find using my magnesis rune. Then I carefully place the new metallic objects at the end of the current to bridge the gap, and voila! It works! This was one of the biggest highlights of the game for me, which is saying a lot for an adventure filled with highlights. Being able to have that same kind of freedom again with the abilities in a Metroid title, built from the ground up using this philosophy? Now that would be a treat. But this isn't just about making the game more fun, it's also about good marketing. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, let's keep riding this Zelda train for a bit, shall we? Breath of the Wild is currently one of the best-selling games on the Switch, sitting at just over 22 million copies respectively. This is even more than Super Mario Odyssey, which sits at just under 21 million copies. A mainline Zelda outselling a mainline Mario title is simply unprecedented, or was until very recently at least. Now there are a handful of factors that led to this, but I would argue one of the biggest reasons Breath of the Wild achieved this great feat was because it was able to stay in the public consciousness far longer than Super Mario Odyssey. The reason for it is, 1, it was really good, duh, you know this if you've played the game, and 2, because players were constantly finding new tricks and posting them online for the world to see. These cool discoveries and wacky moments would instantly go viral and circulate through various social media apps, keeping the Discord going fresh for years to come. Now, I'm not saying Metroid is going to do Zelda numbers, not even close. But by allowing players to share all their discoveries and exploits to sequence break the game, there is an opportunity to create a long-lasting conversation that extends beyond just the Metroid community. If people are talking about Metroid for an extended period of time, the series has a bright future ahead of it. Maybe even possibly breaking Metroid Prime's record of 2.8 million copies. Plenty of other Nintendo series have gone dormant, long to be forgotten by the big N as they struggle to figure out what to do with these once legendary names. But despite all the odds, Metroid always comes back eventually. Nintendo knows that they are sitting on one of their best series, but haven't figured out how to allure more players into trying it out. Perhaps creating this conversation on social media is the key to Metroid finding mainstream success. If that's the case, then I'm even more in favor of it because of all the bullet points I've talked about. Success is by far my most wanted addition to a new 2D Metroid. Well, that, and please just make it a sequel to Fusion. Come on, Nintendo! It's almost been 2 decades now, I need to know what happens next! Wow, thank you so much for all of you who stuck around and listened to me ramble about video games for way too long. And an especially huge thanks to Mr. Brandon Taylor, aka That Metroid Guy, who helped me edit this monstrosity together. If you want to check out some of Brandon's other work, including his top-notch Metroid lore series, be sure to check out the link in the description and subscribe to his channel. Maybe mine too if you have the energy. Nah, okay, that's cool too, no worries. Anyways, Nintendo's E3 Direct is tomorrow actually, as of the time of this upload, so let's see how well or poorly this whole thing ages, huh? Until next time, I will see you all next mission.